Hey friends, Toby here. Hey, I wanted to let you know about a brand new offer this year. We are revamping our volunteer management fundamentals course and we are offering it live. It's called Volunteer Management Fundamentals Live. So you will have access to the course online, but also a pop-up community and 5 coaching calls with yours truly. And so it really is something unique. We don't offer this very often. In fact, this may be the last time I offer it where I'll be coaching. So I wanted to give you this opportunity to join us. We'll be going through 5 modules over 5 weeks. We're starting June 17th. And we're taking a pit stop the week of July 4th of Independence Day here in the U.S. because most people take that off. So we'll have a little bit of break. But every Thursday, we'll be meeting for coaching calls. You'll be progressing through the course. We'll be focusing on what you need to know now in today's world to lead volunteers. So if you are a beginning leader of volunteers, or you're an organization that is really looking to level up your volunteer strategy, you are going to get some pretty good insights through this course. And I'm going to have everybody work on a capstone project that helps them complete a deliverable by the end of the course that can help them move forward with their program. So you get to choose, but I'll be coaching you all the way through. So I hope you'll check it out. All you need to do is go to volpro.net/begin. That's volpro.net/begin and check out the course offer, get enrolled. We have generous discounts for teams, and I would love to see you there. Take care.
Welcome to the Volunteer Nation podcast, bringing you practical tips and big ideas on how to build, grow, and scale volunteer talent. I'm your host, Tobi Johnson, and if you rely on volunteers to fuel your charity, cause, membership, or movement, I made this podcast just for you.
Hey everybody, Tobi here with Volunteer Nation. Welcome to the pod. Today I want to talk about what is a volunteer and why it matters to your organization. You know, there's a lot of debate out there about what a volunteer actually is. What is the definition of a volunteer? Some organizations have really wide, far-reaching definitions. Pretty much anybody helping anybody without getting paid is a volunteer. But there's also organizations that have very strict definitions of a volunteer. And I want to talk through and kind of pull this apart a little bit, talk about what is a volunteer, why it matters, and some of the things you might want to think about if your organization doesn't yet have this in writing. It's so important that you have a definition in your organization. What is it in writing? And, you know, if you don't, there's a lot of issues because of that. And I want to talk through what are the challenges that come up when you're not clear on what your organization believes a volunteer to be. So let's get started. You know, recently the independent sector, along with the Do Good Institute at the University of Maryland, released the most recent dollar value of volunteer time. And it's broken down. I'll put a link to their website so you can go check it out. It's broken down by state, but the national number is $36.14, which per hour, which is a 3.9% increase from the year before. And, you know, there is a lot of debate in our sector about whether or not using what we call a wage equivalent model, which is saying, you know, if a volunteer hours worth $36 an hour and someone contributes $10 hours, then that volunteer is worth $360, or that volunteer's time is worth this amount. Now, we know that not all time contributed is the same. Some people, we have pro bono volunteers, legal volunteers, people who have professional careers who are donating their time, and their hourly rate is hundreds of dollars an hour. So we know this is an average, first of all. We also know that there are lots of other things that volunteers bring to the table besides their time. And their time, that's only one way to look at their time. But it does start to bring up the question, well, whose time gets counted into that dollar amount? And then we'll get into a little bit more about all the other ways that volunteer value can be calculated. But
if we're going to make that calculation, we're going to choose to use that as one of the ways that we're valuing volunteer time, because it can be helpful in certain aspects of our communications with stakeholders, depending on the stakeholder group we're talking to. It's important to know whose time we're counting, right? And that means we have to have a definition of a volunteer. So what is a volunteer, really? Most organizations think they know the answer until you start asking people. Then confusion, tension, even burnout starts showing up because people aren't clear about their own roles vis-a-vis volunteers, whether they be volunteers, employees, etc. When what roles aren't clearly defined, volunteers may feel underused and frustrated. Staff may feel overwhelmed and territorial. Expectations can clash. Retention can suffer. People can get very resistant to working together. Whenever you see any of these are symptoms of a lack of clarity. If you see these things happening in your organization where there's tension between paid staff and volunteers, inevitably it is because there is a lack of clarity about roles. So today I want to talk about what is a volunteer, the limitations of viewing volunteers as only wage replacement, how clarity will strengthen staff volunteer partnerships, and how clear roles will improve your volunteer engagement and accountability. So that's what I want to talk about today. So let's start with that, independent sector number, $36.14 in the U.S., right? In the U.S., they look at Bureau of Labor Statistics modeling. If you want to know about their whole methodology, they're very transparent about it. It's on their website. I will link to it directly in the show notes. But they're not trying to hide anything. And they are actually, as much as people, complain about this is a limited way of looking at volunteers, they are actually the only entity in the country right now that's putting out numbers every year. And, as the creator of the Volunteer Management Progress Report, which we did 10 years, a decade of putting reports out, I can tell you it is no easy feat to get that research out every year. So, instead of bashing the value of volunteer time, let's understand it better and then understand its limitations and also how it might be supplemented. I think that's a little more healthy way of looking at this. So what the dollar figure can't tell you when it comes to volunteers is has a built-in ceiling, right? The wage replacement model can only capture wage substitution, labor substitution. So instead of paid staff, we're quote unquote calculating what volunteers are contributing. And, what would it cost to hire a volunteer to do that thing? So it's a floor, not a ceiling, or it has a built-in ceiling. You can't expand from there. What's left out of a purely wage-based valuation, there's a lot of things. So let's go through what some of those things are that are, if we consider other things in addition, we can remove that ceiling of value and start stacking value when it comes to volunteers. So relational capital, that's one thing. So let's say you have a volunteer who's been, contributing time to your food pantry for a decade. They have institutional knowledge. They have donor relationships. They have trust with the community. There may be people that come into your food pantry and know this person really well. They trust them. And, maybe they have some mental health issues that can be behavior they can exhibit behavior that causes a little bit of stress in the food pantry. Maybe your volunteer, because they know them really well, can calm them down. They have that skill set because they know them well. So there's all kinds of things that can happen when there's that relational capital. Another is advocacy and word of mouth. If you think about it, most nonprofit leaders of volunteers will tell me that the number one way they attract new volunteers is through word of mouth. Well, that is a kind of value that's being given to your organization. People who talk about both your volunteer opportunities, but also your mission, your opportunities to make donations and contributions is a marketing asset. It's also a reputational asset that doesn't get counted into that $36 an hour of wage replacement. Okay, so that's another thing that volunteers bring. The other is donor conversion pipeline. And by the way,
I'm not saying that employees don't also bring some of these things. It's not only related to volunteers. Often we focus on volunteers, but some of your paid staff have this kind of capital as well that they bring to your organization. The donor conversion pipeline. We know from data that volunteers are donors and donors are volunteers. And so volunteers who really believe in your cause, volunteers are known to donate higher and more often to nonprofits and more often to the nonprofits that they contribute time to. There hasn't been, as far as I know, research on bequests, etc., estate planning and volunteers leaving their estates, but I've heard anecdotally from, people, leaders of volunteers that I know, that they didn't even realize that some of their volunteers had left a fairly hefty estates when they pass away to the organization. And the leader of volunteers has no idea. And I'm not making the point that they should or shouldn't, but what I am making the point is that volunteers make pretty significant contributions to the nonprofits they love. So there's that donor pipeline. Mission alignment and culture. Volunteers who believe deeply in your cause can shift culture sometimes in ways that employees can't. So volunteers have an interesting kind of influence and credibility sometimes, especially with the public and fellow volunteers, that paid staff don't. In fact, I read a research study years ago that they studied direct service beneficiaries of services from the organization, and they actually rated the volunteers higher than the paid staff because they felt like the volunteers didn't have, any axe to grind in the whole thing, right? So, which, may or may not be true, right? And then community legitimacy. 3 in 4 organizations say that volunteers are important to their operations, with nearly a quarter, 23%, entirely dependent on volunteers. So the question in this case isn't about wage replacement, it's about organizational survival. So if you're listening and you're one of those organizations and you're 100% volunteer run, which many of our nonprofits are as they start out anyway, this is a go or no go if we don't have volunteers. So the independent sector, in terms of this number, acknowledges these limitations. It says that the estimates may still underestimate the full value of volunteer service because they do not consider the many intangible benefits provided by volunteers that cannot be easily quantified. And some of those I just talked about. Okay. So when we think, what is a volunteer? I really want us to not just go down the rabbit hole, or not even rabbit hole, just like cul-de-sac, road that has a dead end, where we think of volunteers just as free labor. It's a dead end street is what it is. When we go down and we just say volunteers are free labor. That's what they are. What is a volunteer? It's a person who gives free labor. Well, yes. And it's some other things too. So that wage replacement is only the start of the conversation. So what is a volunteer? Let's shift gears and talk about the labor definition of volunteer labor. Now, why does the U.S. Department of Labor care about what a volunteer is? Why would they care? Well, because they want to protect, workers, which is their job. U.S. Department of Labor, their job is to protect workers and make sure there are fair working environments for workers across. I used to work as a contractor early in my career, my nonprofit career. I worked in the Department of Labor as a contractor. So I know a fair amount about the Department of Labor because having worked inside it, I used to go down to the Department of Labor in, Chicago to my work, right? So their job, they took it seriously. And at the time, it was really a fun place to work, actually. They really took it seriously about, protecting the U.S. worker. And so, when we think about the definition of a volunteer, the U.S. Department of Labor wants to make sure that people who are doing work that should be paid and not volunteer should actually be classified as an employee or whatever other classification. There's other ones. There's intern, there's paid contractor, there's a few others classifications. But for them, the definition is important because it has to do with whether or not you get paid, right? And maybe, even they get into the business of saying, talking about if you're a nonprofit worker and you volunteer at the organization where you volunteer, they created rules about that. so that people are not taken advantage of. So that's what it's really about. So your country, if you're listening outside the US, your country, no doubt, has laws about the definition of volunteer. I would look at whatever department in your country that works with workforces, labor, etc. So, and not Labor Party for those in the UK. We're talking about workers, right? Okay, check your country's laws about volunteerism and the definition that guides to answer that from a legal perspective. What that question, what the answer to that question is. What is a volunteer? Now, according to the U.S., U.S. Department of Labor, volunteer contributes time to a benefit to a civic, charitable, or humanitarian purpose, less than full-time work, which we start thinking about our really seriously dedicated volunteers who are with us like 40 hours a week. Provide freely without pressure or coercion. And then we start thinking about, what about service learning? What about court-ordered community service? Service is typically associated with volunteer work. What about volunteers who do really high-level things? Employees are not displaced. What about when a budget gets cut from a nonprofit, but they still want to offer that service and they ask volunteers to step up? Does not receive or expect benefits. What about all those gift cards that we're giving volunteers? So you can see how there's a lot of I don't think we're all following the letter of the law here. I also don't think the Department of Labor's out there cracking down on people either, because they've got other things to do, y'all. All right. So what's not a volunteer, according to Department of Labor, contributes time and benefit for a for-profit company. So I, as a for-profit, cannot have volunteers. My company is a private entrepreneurship, sole proprietorship, or LLC, I should say, not sole proprietor. It's an S corporation. Can't have volunteers. Supports not a volunteer. Supports commercial activities, e.g., gift shop. Okay, how many hospital gift shops have volunteers? Full-time or overtime work provided under pressure, volunteering. How many parents have told their kids they have to go volunteer so they can get into college? Come on, y'all. Services typically associated with paid employee work is not a volunteer. Well, what about Doctors Without Borders? That's pretty paid, right? Usually paid. Employees not displaced, receives or expects benefits, then they're not a volunteer. Now, some volunteers like certain perks. I'm not saying we're giving them all gift cards, but you can see how this can start to get complicated. Employee as a volunteer. The Department of Labor has weighed in on this. Employee cannot provide services that are the same as, similar, or related to their regular job duties. Interesting. What about those development staff who volunteer to work at a fundraising event? It's not exactly what they do as a grant writer, but it is part of fundraising, right? Public sector employees, so government employees, can volunteer to provide similar services for a different jurisdiction. So a police could go be a volunteer firefighter, right? Nonprofits cannot request or direct employees to perform volunteer work during the employee's normal working hours, even if it is different than their job. So volunteering nights and weekends in addition to your full-time job, is that not a one-way ticket to burnout? Probably. Depends, right? Can only provide nominal perks or rewards. So I'm going to link to the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division final rulings and option letters, because this my rundown just now probably gave you more questions than answers, as it always does when I'm training on this. So especially because there's so much going on out in the field that doesn't seem to align with what the law is saying. The good news is you can at any time request an opinion letter, if you're in the U.S., from the Department of Labor and say, here's our situation. We would like an opinion letter for you to help us determine what is a volunteer and what is a paid employee role, or a paid intern or contractor. Usually paid intern is considered a contractor, right? So I want you to think about that. Don't be overwhelmed by this right now. But the title of this episode is What is a Volunteer? And I wanted to pull it apart for reals and not give you a pat answer, because it's really not a pat answer, right? We also talk about types of volunteers: episodic volunteers, ongoing regular volunteers, skilled or pro bono volunteers. We also look at volunteers as different from employees, from paid interns. So paid intern is really usually classified as a contractor. We also have unpaid interns. Those unpaid interns should be treated like a volunteer, and their Department of Labor has a little more definition around intern. It has to have a certain amount of training or educational element. Look into it on their website. Volunteers are different than clients and participants, but we could have clients and participants volunteering. In fact, I really love that idea. I think we should really bring in the people we're serving in the community and have them help out at our nonprofits. Why not? They know a lot. They have a lot of lived experience that could make our work better. National service members are not considered volunteers. So our AmeriCorps, VISTA, Civilian Conservation Corps, all those. Now, I know that's a little bit up in the air right now. If you listen to my episode with Kyra Esgate, I think it's already passed, but we talk about, the funding challenges of national service. So I'll link to that episode in the show notes. But we've been interviewing a lot of people and doing a lot of podcasts lately. So I'm not sure on which goes next. All right. So, however, all of these different types of volunteering and the legal definition really begs the question, what is a volunteer? If there is a formal legal definition of a volunteer, but doesn't seem like anybody's really following it, then, again, the most important thing when it comes down to brass tacks is how your organization decides it's going to identify what a volunteer is. So certainly there is external information you need to bring into the conversation. And I've talked about a few different things so far, but in the end, you've got to decide. There's no external authority that's going to tell you unless someone goes to the Department of Labor and says, hey, I contributed all this labor and it actually should be paid. I should be treated as an employee based on the definition of an employee. So there's some risk involved if you just disregard the entire Department of Labor definition. Someone could complain and they could get back pay from you in your organization, or from your organization, not you directly. So the most important thing is to decide what your own definition of a volunteer is. What is a volunteer for our organization? Your definition should be based on your tolerance for risk. Your definition should be based on your stated and unstated organizational values. What do you believe in? If you are believe in strong labor rights, then you're going to be more clear about what a volunteer can and can't do, right? So there's different value sets here that have to come into play. There's an art to it. And then what you stand for and what you're willing to compromise on. So are there things where, it doesn't feel like this is under the Department of Labor's legal definition, but we've been doing it forever, like having gift shop volunteers in our gift shop in our hospital, and we make a profit off of that. So, got to think this through. So there's an art to it. I also recommend you talk to your legal counsel and say, we really need to have a clear classification of what's a volunteer, who's a volunteer. So after the break, I want to talk more about defining volunteer roles versus paid staff roles, because I think you're probably now, wading into that thinking, well, how do we do that? I'll get to it when we come right back. So let's take a break from my rundown of what is a volunteer. And more importantly, why does it matter to define it for your organization? When we come back, I'm going to talk about how we can differentiate between volunteers and paid staff. So don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Hey friends, have you ever felt overwhelmed and unable to focus on the right things at the right time? Maybe you're not even sure where to put your time and energy to get the most traction with your volunteer program. Well, guess what? We've got a tool that can help you. It's called the Volunteer Strategy Scorecard. In about 3 minutes, you can get a PDF report that helps you understand where your gaps are, where you can focus energy to get big traction, and what your maturity levels are across 5 domains of volunteer engagement. It's a super cool tool. It's taken us a while to get it out, so I'm really excited it's finally found its way into the world. I hope you'll check it out. Just click on the link inside the show notes or in the link in the comments below and get started. Again, it only takes 3 minutes, and then you can get a lot of clarity on your next steps. Okay, we're back with my rundown of what is a volunteer, especially what's the difference between, why is it important for us to find? And now I'm going to talk about what is the difference between volunteers and paid staff. Here's the bottom line. Clarity creates confidence. Clarity creates confidence. The definition of a volunteer matters to your organization operationally. This is not just wordsmithing. This is not just an intellectual exercise. It actually will matter to your organization operationally. How you define what is a volunteer in your organization shapes your onboarding, your insurance, your training investment, your reporting, all of it. And so, got to make the decision. And I hope you're getting the point that I'm really encouraging you to have a definition in writing. Yeah. So how do you define the differences between volunteer and paid staff roles? First of all, why does this role clarity matter? I talked about this before the break. If you start seeing the symptoms of a lack of clarity, like tension between volunteers and paid staff aren't willing to accept volunteers in their department. They're worried that volunteers are going to take their jobs. Volunteers are frustrated that they're not given meaningful work. This is all about that role clarity. So you want to define which tasks belong, not only what is a volunteer, but also which tasks belong to volunteers, which tasks belong to paid staff. And those distinctions exist. Like, why do we have these separate groups? Why aren't we just one big family moving the mission forward? Well, because that's not a smart way to go about it. Because in the end, I mean, it works okay when you're a tiny organization, but once you start to scale, that no longer works. So you may be wondering, why should some roles stay employee-led, or should we assign to paid staff? Legal requirements are some, confidentiality, licensing or credentials that are required, risk management, organizational continuity, because it's something that needs to be done on a daily basis, for example, strategic oversight. Maybe this person or this role has to understand the entire fabric of what's going on at the organization, not just their small piece of it. But there's also reasons roles stay staff-led. And these aren't why you should choose that they're staff-led, but I wanted to call these out as well. People won't let go. People won't let go. People are like, no, I'm not going to let this task go. This is not, because their identity is wrapped up into that task. I've seen this in our program when we had our volunteers doing direct service and doing Medicare and health insurance counseling. They also got backed up by paid staff. And some of the paid staff enjoyed that work so much that they would do the majority of it and not leave much of it left to the volunteers, making the volunteers very frustrated. And I would say, there's other things you could be doing at work. Well, yes, but I love it so much and I know how to do it best. Maybe, but can't we train the volunteers to do it better, right? So staff don't want to set boundaries on volunteers. Sometimes people will lead things because they don't want to call someone out for not showing follow through on their required roles, the tasks that they're accountable for or responsible for. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes there's no clarity around the risk management strategy and why volunteers or paid staff should do certain things. Now, all three of the things I just mentioned are driven by fear. They're all driven by fear. The reason that roles stay staff-led in those accounts, those cases, is because people are afraid. And remember, people, clarity, having role clarity can reduce confusion and fear because people are clear on things and they're not guessing and they don't feel like there's something out there to get them, right? All right, let's talk about, we talked before the break about all of the different reasons volunteer roles matter. I'm just going to run down these expanding capacity. I'm just going to run down these really quickly. Expanding capacity, bringing community voice to the table, increasing your reach far beyond your agency doors. Volunteers can do that for you. Building in advocates that are very, very credible, especially with lawmakers, because they're voters. Strengthening trust with your clients and your community, and adding specialized expertise. Because again, no one knows how to do it all. And some people know more than we do, right? So the difference between paid staff and volunteers, when you start to pull this apart, if you're leading a group around this discussion, you need to keep beating the drum that different, but not better. Employees and volunteers, different, but not better. There's not one that's better than the other. They're different, but not better. And just keep that drumbeat going, because people will start to put it in a hierarchy. And certainly when we look at org charts, volunteers are at the bottom usually, if they're on the org chart at all. So there's some mistakes when you're trying to differentiate between volunteer and paid staff roles, giving volunteers vague assignments, using volunteers only for your low-level admin, the grunt work, failing to explain why there are boundaries between staff and volunteer roles or employee and volunteer roles, and assuming that everybody just knows because it's common sense. Forget about that. I think that we are in a common sense recession right now. I'm just going to say it. We hear a lot about trust recession. I have to say we're in a common sense recession at the moment. I don't know. Is it my age talking? Maybe. I don't know. But okay. So when you decided which is volunteer and which is paid staff, make sure that these have really clear role descriptions, responsibilities, boundaries, reporting relationships, decision-making authority, time expectations for specific tasks and reporting. Because without this, people don't feel accountable to it. If it's not in writing, not in a position description. Now, I've talked about role descriptions in the past. They do, especially for volunteers, they do not need to be boring. They can be used as marketing tools. And I'm writing my note because I believe that I did a podcast episode on this, so I'm going to go find it and link to it. If not, I'll link to a blog post on it because I know I've talked about this somewhere. But really, we need to start pivoting and thinking of our role descriptions as marketing tools when we're out there recruiting. Okay, so let me give you a couple examples about why this role clarity really matters when we think about what is a volunteer, figuring out what that definition is. Again, clarity reduces conflict, reduces fear, and increases trust. So here's a couple of examples of the differentiation between a volunteer and a paid staff that are actually working in the same place. Okay, so here's one. A volunteer receptionist may welcome guests and answer basic questions, while paid staff handle confidential client information. So they're both working in the same office, but they have access to different types of information, and they're doing slightly different things. Okay. Here's another one. A volunteer team may handle setup, registration, and guest engagement for an event, and paid staff may oversee budget approvals, risk management, and financial decision-making about that event. Both of these roles are essential. So that gives you another example of, okay, that's how we're dividing the labor based on what we know about our risk, our tolerance for risk, our culture of our organization, the way we want to approach this. And you can see how clear it is when I describe these two examples. And people go, oh, okay, I get that. That's why. Now, people might ask you, why? Why do? Because that's part of our risk management policy, or that's how we figured out our risk management. We're open to changing these roles in the future, but for now, this is where we're starting, right? So let's make sure everybody's rowing together, but rowing in their own lane, right? Otherwise, we're going to have a bunch of boats crashing into each other. All right. For more on strengthening volunteer staff partnerships, I also want to refer you to Volunteer Nation episode 9, which was a long time ago. It was at the very beginning of the podcast, helping nonprofit employees see the value of volunteers. So you can do that. There's also a podcast episode I did on defining the difference between staff and volunteers. Check out Volunteer Nation episode 96, volunteer work or staff position, how to decide. And I dig into this a much deeper level. So I hope that this episode, it has probably invited more questions than given you complete clarity. But what I hope it's done, in addition, is to give you some resources and places to go get that clarity, but also to let you know that this is an important thing, that if you're having tension between volunteers and staff, this may be part of the reason you're just not being clear enough. So it's important to do. So the more clearly your organization can define and answer the question, what is a volunteer, the more likely it's going to be that people can work together successfully. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a call to action. Review your volunteer role descriptions, talk openly with your staff about volunteer partnerships, clarify expectations and where the problems align, and
figure out, if you don't have a description of an answer to what is a volunteer at your organization, let's start to get that figured out. And I know it takes a fair amount of conversation, but you could come to the table with, if you're the person responsible for this, if you're not, if you're leadership, then delegate it. But if you're a leader of volunteers and you're the internal consultant around volunteerism in your org, then draft something up, give everybody a straw man to start working against, and figure it out. Even form a little task force around this. Make sure you have a beginning, middle, and end that doesn't go on forever. But I would say, in 60 to 90 days of meetings, you could have this hammered out and figured out. So also, if you're interested in just, we talked about all the benefits that volunteers bring to the table, I have a tool that can help you surface those talents and skills and benefits that they bring through your interview process when you're bringing on new volunteers. So we have a free volunteer interview question cheat sheet that's on our website. It's on volpro.net, freebie volunteer nonprofit volunteer interview question. My Lord, that is a long URL. Go to our show notes page, link to it there. But make sure that you're asking the right nonprofit volunteer interview questions. And this cheat sheet can help you understand the motivations, the skills, the interests, the preferences of volunteers versus really just having a conversation about their availability and which role they want to choose. So it's about a two-way conversation and gives you a list of top questions you should be asking when you're interviewing volunteers. And it will also show you how to start out your interview in the right way, which is always good. So I hope this has helped you think through the question, what is a volunteer? And given you some impetus to think about getting this in writing if it's not clear to your organization. And don't feel bad if it isn't. Most organizations do not have this in writing, have not built a shared definition together. Very important. It will make a difference to your teamwork between volunteers and staff, and it will give you a little bit of peace of mind. Again, if you need advising, talk to your legal counsel at your organization. And also you can always, if you're in the US, you can ask for an opinion letter from the Department of Labor. If you're in another country, I'm not sure, but I'm certain there are people there that can help you navigate this interesting landscape. Okay? So I hope this has been helpful. If you've liked it, I hope you'll share it with a friend. Of course, we always love ratings and reviews. We love those 5-star ratings because it helps us get in front of more people. And we know what we've got to share here is of value. Why do I know it? Because I hear from people all the time that it is. So I'm glad it is. It's a labor of love. And I hope you'll join me next week. Same time, same place on the Volunteer Nation. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Volunteer Nation podcast. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review so that we can reach more people like you who want to improve the impact of their good cause. For more tips and notes from the show, check us out at tobijohnson.com. We'll see you next week for another installment of Volunteer Nation.